What's up everyone? My name's Matt, this is my channel Fantastic Northwest. Today I want to talk about the Canon EOS RP camera. I've had this for 4 months now. This is my first real camera that I've had. I've been into photography now since December of 2022. Now that I've had this for a few months, let me give you my opinions by answering 5 of your questions that you might have about the Canon EOS RP. So first question, is it a professional camera? This really depends on what your definition of professional is. To me, some of the pros of this camera is that it's a full frame mirrorless camera. Mirrorless cameras are much lighter than their old DSLR predecessors. It's got a 26 megapixel sensor in it, so that's plenty of detail for any type of photography that you need to do. And it's also got all of the manual settings that you could ever need in a camera. Now some of the downsides of this camera, it's not super weatherproof, so you're not going to want to take this out into the rain. It's also got a low battery life. It's rated at up to 250 shots. I have got plenty more than that. I've got almost 1,000 shots with this, but being that it is such a small camera, it's got a really small battery in it too. One of the biggest issues for me personally is it doesn't have in-body image stabilization. Being able to stabilize your footage is really important when you're shooting video, and this just doesn't have it in it, so that's definitely a downside. It's definitely more of an entry-level camera. It's going to be up to you whether you consider it a professional camera. You could definitely use it to make money, so if that's your definition of a professional camera, then this meets the definition. But in the end, more professional photographers are going to want something a little bit higher end to keep up with their more demanding work. I'm just an amateur photographer, so this works really well for me. Now, I didn't mention anything about 4K video, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the video. Alright, number 2, is it good for beginners? Price-wise, it's a great deal. Relative to some of the higher end models, this is a steal at $1,000. You can really get expensive cameras, over $3,000–$4,000 and much higher. So I think beginners will like the price point of this camera. It's also got an auto mode, which is really great for beginners. When you're just starting out, you're not going to know how to use any of the manual settings yet, and so having that auto mode when you're just starting out is really good. Another reason it's really good for beginners is that it's got a pretty simple user interface. It may seem complicated at first, but it doesn't take a long time to get up to speed on how to use it, and so beginners should feel comfortable using it pretty quickly. It also shoots really high resolution photos. 26 megapixels is plenty for a beginner. There are cameras that have much higher megapixel count, up to 60 megapixels, but for a beginner you're not going to need anything more than 26. So I'd say if you're just getting started out in photography, then the Canon EOS RP is a really good deal. Alright, next up, does it shoot 4K video? The technical answer to that is yes, but there's a catch. When shooting 4K, you can only go up to 24 frames per second, which is fine for most of your video shooting, but if you're going to want to do any sort of slow motion, you can't do that in 4K. Another really big problem, at least for me, with shooting 4K with this camera is that it's got a cropped sensor. What this basically means is that everything you shoot is going to be zoomed in a lot more than you're expecting. I'll throw an example up on screen right here so you can see the difference between the cropped sensor of the 4K and then the full frame of the 1080p. So I mostly shoot using a 50mm lens. When I'm shooting 4K, the crop sensor makes it closer to an 80mm lens. And that's just way too much for most of my filming. Finally, when shooting in 4K, the camera has a much weaker autofocus. I've never really noticed this personally, but it is something that they mention on the Canon website. So just be aware that if you're shooting in 4K, the autofocus may not be quite as good as it regularly is. Now for me personally, I don't use 4K at all when using my Canon camera. If I want to shoot 4K, which this video is being shot in 4K right now, I just use my iPhone 14 Pro. It's actually much better than the Canon, in my opinion. Alright, number 4, how is this camera any different from Canon's EOS R? Well, to start, the EOS R is about $800 more expensive than this. This one only goes for about $1,000, and I think I've seen it recently on sale for $900. The R does have a 30 megapixel sensor, whereas this one only has a 26 megapixel sensor, but in the end that's not a huge difference. Another difference between the two cameras is that the EOS R can shoot in 4K at 30 frames per second, whereas the RP can only shoot in 24 frames per second. The EOS R also has a slightly better autofocus system, at least according to the official Canon website. And then one other difference, not a huge deal, but the EOS R is a slightly larger camera. The dimensions are very similar, but it is slightly larger. And finally, what is the Canon EOS RP best for? It's really great for traveling. Its lightweight and compact size make it really great for going on vacations. You can just throw it in your bag and it doesn't take up a whole lot of space. Another thing the RP is really good for is wildlife photography. Because it's a mirrorless camera, it's got a silent shutter. It makes almost no noise when you take a picture. Compare that to the old DSLR cameras that were much louder. It's also got interchangeable lenses, so you can add a telephoto lens. These will be really big lenses that allow you to zoom in a lot on your subject. But this is a big benefit of these type of cameras that allow you to put on new lenses. Compared to point and shoot cameras, this is much better for wildlife photography. Now I want to remind you though, if you're new to photography and don't know too much about these types of cameras, they often don't come with lenses. Sometimes they'll come with a kit lens, but you can also buy the camera just by itself. But you still need to buy a separate lens because these cameras can't be shot without a lens on it. And lastly, on wildlife photography, this camera has a 26 megapixel camera. That's going to be plenty of detail, at least when you're starting out. If you're photographing something like birds, then this will be plenty of detail for you. And one other style of photography that the RP is really good at is for portrait shooting. That 26 megapixels gives plenty of detail, especially in the subject's faces and hair. And if you pair this camera with a lens that has a really low aperture, then you can get some really nice looking blurry backgrounds in your portraits. Now, the Canon EOS RP may not be considered professional by most professional photographers, but it's definitely more than capable of producing some really high quality results. Now, I've had this for about 4 months now, and it's been really great. I love taking it out on the weekends and going out and doing some photography. The biggest problem I've had with it and the biggest letdown is definitely the video quality. Not having any image stabilization is a really big problem for me. It's almost impossible to shoot any video that doesn't have any shakiness in it, and I really wish the 4K was more usable. Now, if you're just starting out, I think it's a great option. However, if you've got a really nice high-end smartphone, then you might just want to wait until you've got a little bit more money to spend on a slightly nicer camera. Thanks for sticking around to the end. If you like this video, then go ahead and drop a like, and if you're not subscribed already, go ahead and do that. And feel free to leave a comment down below.